All right, so let's have a look at how to set this character up right here. This is the alpha character from Agora. So I'm gonna load the character fresh and set it up to sort of to look like this. It includes the hair. There's no limits and no fingers. But the overall approach is to use to try and stick with the controls rather than any joints or any more advanced particulars. You'll notice that I've switched the character into FK, or maybe you don't notice that because you don't know this rig. So let me open up this rig from scratch and we'll start setting it up. All right, this is she, and you'll notice that by default she's put into IK mode. If I move various parts, you'll see she's an entire IK character. And one of the things we want to do with Ragdoll is to assign to the body parts, not to the things driving the body parts. Sometimes the thing driving the body part moves like the body part, like the hip. This control moves just like the hip. So assigning to the hip flesh and assigning to this control is the same. But assigning to this pole vector, for example, it can translate and it's hovering outside the limb. Like we really want to capture the upper arm, not the thing driving the upper arm. A lot of times the joints are a good option for that because the joints ultimately drive the mesh. So if we can follow whatever drives the mesh, we know we're going to be following the mesh as well. You could also potentially assign like a locator to follow the mesh and then assign to that. But in this case, we're going to avoid all of that because we want to stick with just the controls. So I'm going to switch the entire character into FK. So now we have controllers. So now this control and the limb, in this case the lower arm, they are the same. They move as one. So we can assign to the control and pretend that we've assigned to the lower arm because they are one. They move the same. Same goes for the legs. This control moves just like the lower leg, so we can use this control as a representative of the lower leg, and likewise for the feet and so on. Generally with IK this is the case. And there's a lot of controls that we don't need. Some of them are a bit more complex. They don't necessarily drive a particular limb. They do some specific behavior for the limb. So like this right here is already quite complicated because as you can see we're rotating a control, but even the Maya gizmo is struggling to keep up because presumably the rotation of the pelvis is connected to another control, a parent control. So we're rotating two controls at once here. Ideally, we'd assign to both of these so that we can get the entire. Let's say so we can follow both the invisible one and the pelvis. I'm going to avoid this in this video just to keep it strictly to the controls. Likewise, this one doesn't really rotate the pelvis like in this way. It's kind of a funny control. It doesn't really represent a real limb. It's like an indirect control, kind of like an IK control, kind of like the pole vectors we saw out here. So we're going to ignore that altogether. In fact, I'm going to put a bunch of controls that we don't need just on a layer so we can avoid any confusion. Like we don't need these guys. So I'm just going to hide these. No, an animation layer, a display layer. This one, likewise, I'm going to put that here as well. And I found that there are some face controls that we can hide. Something like that. So these are the controls we're going to be assigning to. They represent the entire character. I found that there's a clavicle control here as well, so we'll assign to that as well. And like the arm, this clavicle control and the clavicle, they move as one, so it's safe to assign to this. The one control we're gonna have a little bit of problem with is this dual control, but yeah, I'll get to that once we start recording. All right, so let's start assigning to the hip, pelvis. I'm gonna get the neck and the head, and assign and connect. So assign and connect is important here because if we just assign, we will get markers onto the controls, but they will not be connected to each other basically. So I'm going to use the assign and connect. One thing I found here was that the head control doesn't have a length. So the head marker is also, it gets a radius and length of 0. So let's adjust that length, and I mean both of them, both of them need some shape just to get started. All right, at this point we can hide some of the controls, keep the mesh. Let's just tune the shape, just so we're on the right track. You can see how the pivot for the torso is in the middle of the chest, which is not really like, there's no, you can't rotate around here. It's kind of a fictional pivot. Like you would rotate below the torso. Like the torso, the sort of the chest area is it's basically one big rigid block. So in the middle, it's not really possible to rotate. But the controls have pivots here, so we're sort of limited to the pivots of the controls if we are to assign to the controls. This is also another good reason to use the joints, because there will be joints, around the points where he would anatomically be rotating around. So the control is sort of a high level, like an abstraction of the chest and spine, so that they move as one. And it's not really that suited to assign to. But in this case, we're going to ignore that and just go for the controls anyway, just to see what we end up with. So just scale these up. Also, you'll notice that I only have 2 markers for the entire torso, the entire spine area. Doesn't give us a lot of flexibility, because, like I mentioned, there's a hidden one in the middle somewhere. For the neck, I'm gonna make this a bit bigger because it is very thin, and if the head was this big, like if she was real and she had a head this big, she would not be able to lift her head. Like the amount of muscle that would have to go through, she would have to have some sort of tendons, like in the fingers. The muscles aren't really in the fingers; they're sort of all the way up here, and you have tendons that go down to pull on the fingers to grasp and to move your fingers, because there's just not enough room in the fingers to have that amount of muscle. They're offset. So for this, for the head to be lifted by this tiny spine, she would have to have something similar, like tendons going on around here. So to make this work physically, we have to make a rather large neck. I'm also going to lower the density of the head, so that the head is basically hollow, because again, it's not physically possible for her head to be this big relative to her neck. Let's just see what that looks like. And so this kind of works. You see how with the default stiffnesses, she's able to keep her head up. But if I were to reduce this to approximately the size of the neck, we should already see that she cannot really, it's not really possible. We can crank up the stiffness and force it, but ultimately it's not a realistic, anatomy. So we have to sort of compensate for that. Something like that is sufficient. So from here, let's get the controls back and carry on assigning to the, we can include the clavicle. Let's ignore the clavicle just to keep it simple and just focus on the arm controller. So torso, arm, and assign and connect. You'll notice that the hand gets a very long default shape. It's because it's the last control that we select. So for the lower arm, it knows how long to make the lower arm because we selected the hand. So it knows to go from the elbow to the hand. This is the length. But because we don't have a second selection after the hand, it sort of has to guess, and it uses the last length per default. So that's why the hand is as long as the lower arm. We'll adjust that in a moment. The torso, arm, basically just repeating what we did on the other side. We'll carry on with the leg. And I noticed that there's 2 controls. There's a main control and a hip control. I think these are it's just apparent to the leg. So we can select either. It doesn't really matter. I'm going to use the inner one. And likewise for the lower ham and the foot. And like before, the foot is going to get a funky default shape because it doesn't know where the foot is going. In this case, so normally it would use the same axis as well, but I think the axis of the feet is a bit funny. So we have the X facing in the direction here, and then here X is facing down. So preferably, like it assumes that X carries on through the foot, or in this case, like that the Z axis would be the axis that's pointing forward, but here Z is pointing sideways. So it's it's doing its best, but it doesn't really know. It doesn't know the true answer. We'll tune that too, and then repeat on the other side, the foot as well. There we go. I mean, at least it's symmetrical, so that helps. Okay, great. We have the entire character. If we just hit play, we'll see that she does work. Nothing explodes. The feet are popping out of the ground because they are intersecting with the ground at the moment. The hands are falling down, which is what we'd expect. If we were to say that the pelvis is not animated, but it is whatever the group is, we should find that she falls to the ground as we'd expect. So let's tune some of these shapes. The arms, for example. Can make these a bit shorter. Generally, you just want to make it because she's very thin, and that makes her very weak in terms of the like the stiffness values. So you kind of want to make her arms as big as you can, especially if you don't care for collisions around this area. Just make them as large as you can get away with. It'll make your stiffness values that much more effective, just like we saw on the neck. So for the hands, we can probably make these boxes because, well, that's very narrow. Very, 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 very narrow. Something like that. And I'd usually make the feet boxes as well. The pelvis in the example I showed you, I had the pelvis sideways. We can do that here as well. But again, so the pivot for the upper torso part is somewhere in the middle. So if we make the shape, like the shape is going to rotate around here, it's kind of unnatural. But we'll see what we can get away with. That's fine, that's fine, that's fine. And the legs, let's make these boxes as well. I'm going to tweak this from here now. Something like that. Likewise for you. Something like this. In this case, I'm just going to remove the offset and rotation and start from scratch, because it didn't really get a good default for those. Alright, and then we can take these and just move those up a little bit, rotate these, just so that she's standing on the ground. There we go. And now if we were to relax her like a lot, so we should again see that the head is the first thing to go, right? Because everything in the body is weak now, but the head is so heavy. So let's start by reducing the density on the head, something like just 10 times less. So you can see on the mass here that with the density of 1, with the same density as the rest of the body, like if everything was the same material, which is in reality would be, it would weigh 7 kilos, and the torso weighs 6 kilos. So the head in this case is as heavy. I mean, in this case it's heavier than the whole torso. Which is not realistic. So let's reduce it to a very low value, so 10 times less, 700 grams. Then this ratio of like 10 times less than the torso is pretty good. So now we'll find that the head behaves more like we expect. All right, that's good. And I think we don't have anything that's overlapping. Like no grandchildren are overlapping. If we had the clavicles, then the clavicle would be in the middle here, so we'll have like a big, like an area with lots of overlapping shapes, which would, we'd need to create some collision groups to avoid self-intersections, but I think in this case we're safe. So if I enable self-collisions now, yeah, she holds up pretty good. So now we get collisions with the ground and collisions with self, wherever they should happen. So like here we have some collisions with the head. All right, almost done. So the final thing that I had in the video that I showed you was also the hair. So let's include that. I found that the last control doesn't really do much. Like it does affect the geometry, but it doesn't really have a real, like it doesn't represent anything like we don't need it in this case. So let's assign to all the other controls. We can include the last one just to get the length of the last marker, and then we can delete it. There we go. So now we have the length of U is correct. So then we can go ahead and select the last one and just hit delete. And like before, because if she had this hair in real life, again, the hair is so large, but in this case, the density is actually much lower than the head, because now we're talking a very, like most of this is air. So I would still make a rather thick base, but we're going to lower the density quite a bit on the hair so we can get it to behave as we expect. Something like this. Like I wouldn't want to collide with the outermost vertices, because then like we kind of want to emulate some softness to the hair. So when the hair approaches the ground, we would sort of have to imagine that it flattens a bit before it collides. And finally you. Wasn't there one more shape inside of here? No? Okay. I think we missed one of the controls, but it doesn't really matter. Something like that. So by default, you'll see, because the head is so light and the density of the hair is, you know, a default 1.0, it's like she's wearing a dumbbell on her head. That's not really realistic. So again, like before, I'm going to select all of these and bring the density. In this case, the density in this UI only goes to 0.1, but I want it to go a bit lower than that. So I'm going to go here and say 0.02. I think that was a value that worked quite well. So now you can see that the hair does affect the head, but very little. You know, that's kind of what we would expect. But I would expect the base to be a bit stronger, because also it's sort of tied up in this ribbon. So the ribbon would sort of compress the hair, and it would be a bit more dense than the rest of the hair. So we can either crank up the density on just the base, but then we would make the head also droop more. So instead, I'm just going to increase the density, or increase the stiffness rather, on the base. So now the base would be a bit stronger and try and hold the hair back. I think for the first, like the big hair shape, I'll probably do the same thing, but probably less, maybe 3. Just so we get a bit more elasticity on the hair, and something like that is fine. All right, so for the final trick is to record this, and because we've assigned to controllers that all are meant to be keyframed, like this is meant to have its channels keyframed, and this one, everything we've assigned to is also meant to be animated, and so that's convenient, because it means that we can just record without doing any retargeting. Like we don't have to tell Ragdoll to put keyframes on anything else, anything other than we've assigned. So let's just hit record and see what happens. I'm just going to use the default, no tricks, and yeah, let's go. So the first stage is fine. I noticed that here, once it starts making constraints to the Ragdoll physics character, I'm getting a couple of cycle warnings in the script here. Normally I would not trust the result, and I mean the cycles comes from the fact that there is this double transformation. So we're sort of forcing it to follow the Ragdoll marker, but it sort of well, I'm not really sure actually. I haven't dove too deeply into this rig, but I found that the results still follow Ragdoll, so it doesn't really. I don't think it's a problem, but I would avoid assigning to this control, and I would find the joints for this one just to avoid the cycle warning. So you can still assign to the joints of the pelvis, but then retarget to this control. So you still get the keyframes here, but you would get no cycle warnings, and you probably would get a few extra markers in here to make it a bit more, to make the spine more flexible in physics as well. But there you have it. So apart from this, there's no special tricks. There are a couple of areas where you might want to consider joints, like the spine, and if you wanted to use your IK controls, then obviously it doesn't really, you can't really assign to the pole vector, for example. So you would have to assign to the joints for that, and then recharge it to the pole vector and IK hand. So I would recommend looking at the forum and the documentation for tutorials on IK, because there's plenty of those as well. That's about it, so hope it helped. See ya.